Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to join this debate today. And just for reference sake, we're reporting, this is with reference to a report on the Standing Committee for Foreign Affairs and International Development, recognizing Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa. And clearly, this report, as we've heard from previous speakers, is an important one and one that is worthy of debate and discussion. And so I'm delighted to have that opportunity today. Mr. Speaker, the Middle East has been a profoundly complex region for centuries, and the Arab-Israeli conflict has been one of the most persistent issues on the global agenda for decades. Today we have an opportunity to consider how Canada, recognized worldwide for our enlightened approach toward individuals and communities in need of refuge, can appropriately address the issue of Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa in a principled way. In May 2013, the Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs and International Development heard the profoundly personal stories of Jewish people uprooted from their homes of many centuries in Egypt and Iraq, and their subsequent migration to Israel or Canada, for which they have never received appropriate recognition. Mr. Speaker, in my address today, I'll be discussing the prevailing context for Jewish communities at the time of Israel's independence, the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the current state of the peace process as it pertains to the government's response to the committee's recommendations. Large parts of the over 4,000 years of history of the Jewish people is a history of exile, persecution, exclusion, and anti-Semitism. As we consider the questions in front of us today, it is important to recall the profound horrors endured by Jewish communities around the globe. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern era, Jews experienced persecution almost anywhere they lived. It is for precisely these reasons that in the late 19th century, Theodor Herzl formalized the case for the establishment of a Jewish state. Amidst pogroms in the Russian Empire and widespread anti-Semitism in Europe, Herzl's vision resounded with the Jewish diaspora and thus began significant Jewish migration to Ottoman Palestine in the late 19th and 20th centuries. It is important to note that at the time, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities often lived together peacefully in the Middle East in adjacent, if distinct, communities in the great cities of Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad. However, at the same time, as the momentum behind Jewish migration to the Holy Land grew, the geopolitical arrangements of the previous centuries were beginning to unravel. As European alliances erupted into World War I, the weakening Ottoman Empire collapsed after ruling over a large part of the Middle East and North Africa for a half a millennium, including over 400 years in Jerusalem and the surrounding area. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Europe's colonial powers took control over remaining parts of the empire, with France claiming Syria and Lebanon, and Britain gaining a mandate over Transjordan and Palestine in 1920. Increasing anti-Semitism in Europe following World War I accelerated Jewish migration to mandate Palestine, further building on the small Jewish community that had formed, some of which had been present for centuries. During the period of the British mandate, the Jewish population of Palestine grew from 1/6 to nearly 1/3 of the overall population, and tensions began to grow between the Jewish and Arab populations, resulting in riots in Jaffa and a massacre in Hebron in 1929. A decade later, back in Europe, the Jewish people endured some of humanity's darkest days, and during the Holocaust, the Nazis systematically murdered over 6 million Jewish people. While not the subject of today's discussion, it is important here to recall the sheer horror of the Holocaust, the impact that this dreadful experience had on the collective Jewish psyche, and the guidance that this terrible sequence of events should provide to people of conscience everywhere when discussing the modern state of Israel. After the Holocaust, the international community did indeed come to recognize the compelling need for the establishment of a Jewish state, and Canada was proud to be one of the countries preparing the blueprint for peace as part of the 1947 UN Special Committee on Palestine, contributing the services of Sir Ivan Rand, a Canadian Supreme Court justice. That committee, with Rand playing an important swing role, proposed a two-state solution, a Jewish state and an Arab state. Together with an international regime governing Jerusalem. The committee's recommendation ultimately resulted on November 29, 1947, in the passage of UN General Assembly Resolution 181, setting out the partition plan. Mr. Speaker, Canada was proudly among the 33 countries who voted for that resolution to ensure it gained the two-thirds of votes required to pass, despite pressure from Britain to abstain. Unfortunately, among the 13 countries who voted against Resolution 181 were a number of neighboring states in the region who would not support the establishment of a Jewish state. It was no surprise then that following Israel's declaration of independence in May 1948, a protracted state of war followed. Israel was immediately attacked by neighboring Arab states. The Haganah, the predecessor to today's Israel Defense Forces, successfully defended the newly established Jewish state, and by the time the armistice in 1941 had in fact expanded its borders well beyond those envisaged in the 1947 partition plan. Those Palestinian Arabs who remained in their homes throughout the war period were granted Israeli citizenship. Those who fled were deemed Palestinian refugees. As the committee concluded in its November 2013 report, one of the main messages to emerge from the committee's hearings is that the two refugee populations were created by the Arab-Israeli conflict, one Palestinian and one Jewish. Just as Canada was driven by its humanitarian values to support the establishment of the State of Israel, so too Canada played an important role in supporting the needs of Palestinian refugee communities, both directly and through the UN. The committee's hearings, however, have brought overdue attention to a second refugee population created following the 1948 war, that of the Jewish communities throughout the Middle East and North Africa. As the detailed presentations to the committee show, over 850,000 Jewish people lived in Arab countries in 1948. As noted earlier, these communities had lived together peacefully with their Christian and Muslim neighbors for centuries. Following the adoption of the partition plan and the Declaration of Independence of Israel, Jewish communities in the Middle East and North Africa faced a changed landscape, becoming the subject to suspicion, fear, and violence. And within 10 years, over half had left these countries, with the vast majority of the remaining families following in the next 20 years. Today, the once vibrant Jewish quarters of Damascus, Cairo, and Sana'a are Jewish in name only. In many cases, as the committee poignantly heard, when Jewish families left, they left with nothing, despite leaving land and homes behind. There is, however, no UN agency responsible for the primary services of these populations, Mr. Speaker, and there are no camps housing them. Most resettled in Israel or in welcoming countries such as Canada. As the committee heard, however, these ultimately divergent outcomes do not negate the need for recognition of the experience of Jewish refugees who were displaced from states in the Middle East and North Africa after 1948. The eventual success of the State of Israel and the successful integration of many Jewish families into other countries do not diminish the need to acknowledge this very difficult experience. The government is also in agreement with the committee's view that recognition of the experiences of Jewish refugees does not diminish or compete with the situation of Palestinian refugees. It It is important, therefore, to ensure that the statements and actions of the Government of Canada do not undermine current negotiations or seek to prejudge their outcome. In this regard, the ensuing history of the Arab-Israeli conflict is pertinent to today's discussion. Amidst an environment of continued hostility towards the Jewish state, Israel continued to mature into a strong democracy. During the upheaval of the Cold War, Israel continued to attract Jewish migrants from all over the world, who saw in Israel a place where they would forever be free from persecution. Israel was not, however, free from enemies. Following the 1948 war, Jordan had occupied the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Egypt took control over the Gaza Strip, both areas which were part of the planned Arab state envisioned in UN Resolution 181. As tension mounted, the Six-Day War erupted in 1967, and Israel's victory resulted in its occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, as well as the Sinai and the Golan Heights. A second conflict in 1973 with Egypt, Syria, and Jordan confirmed Israel's military supremacy in the region. In the ensuing decades, in addition to demonstrating strength, Israel has demonstrated its willingness to make peace with its neighbors when such efforts are genuine. As a result, in 1979, Israel and Egypt signed a historic peace accord which returned the Sinai to Egypt and ended the hostilities between Israel and the largest Arab state. In 1994, Jordan followed suit and signed a peace treaty with Israel. The latter agreement was signed in the context of great optimism for peace in the region, with secret talks between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, resulting in the Oslo Accords of 1993, granting the Palestinians self-governance over parts of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and Palestinian aspirations of statehood left unfulfilled since UN Resolution 181 seemed within reach. The great optimism of this period was shattered, however, with the assassination in 1995 of Yitzhak Rabin by an extremist Jewish settler, Yigal Amir. With the architect of the Oslo Accords gone, commitment to the process faded, and instead, nearly 2 decades of intermittent violence and continued military occupation have ensued. This brings us to the present day. The nearly 20 years since Rabin's assassination have been numerous attempts by the international community, and in particular the U.S., to bring the two sides back together to achieve a final status agreement. Wye River, Sharm el-Sheikh, Taba, Annapolis, and Amman have been the sites of summits and conferences, but none have resulted in agreement acceptable to the parties. Canada's foreign policy objective throughout has been a comprehensive two-state solution, reached through a negotiated agreement between the parties that guarantees Israel's right to live in peace and security with its neighbors and lead to the establishment of a viable, independent Palestinian state. Today, with U.S. stewardship, an opportunity to achieve such an historic peace may be before us. Under the leadership of U.S. President Barack Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry, the peace process has begun again in earnest, with Palestinian and Israeli negotiators meeting regularly since July 2013. It is understood that all final status issues are on the table, including borders, security, settlements, and security for Jerusalem and refugees. This follows a period during which hopes for peace had all but faded, and the Palestinians sought to gain control through unilateral actions such as a statehood bid at the United Nations. Mr. Speaker, Canada's support for a negotiated settlement between Israel and the Palestinians, like our opposition to the statehood initiative in November 2012, is based on the recognition that a just and lasting peace will only be achieved through direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians as spelled out in UN Resolution 242 and 338. Today, these negotiations may present the last chance to achieve the two-state solution. For those committed to the defense of the Jewish state and the establishment of a Palestinian state, the current process is a genuine opportunity for peace. Secretary Kerry has obtained explicit backing from the Arab League for the initiative, reiterating the Arab Peace Initiative that would make an Israel-Palestinian peace the cornerstone for Israel's security in the wider region and recognition from its neighbors. Unlike the Madrid process of the 1990s, this is a direct bilateral consultation with strong U.S. engagement. In line with Canadian statements in recent years, it is our view that this is the only way to achieve a just and lasting peace. For these negotiations to be successful, third parties need to allow the process to unfold and not seek to prejudge its outcome. It is our assessment, therefore, that now is not an opportune time to implement the committee's second recommendation. As the issue of Jewish refugees in the Middle East and North Africa is not currently under negotiation, a request by a third party such as Canada to insert this issue into talks at this stage is unlikely to be helpful. The current negotiations build on years of history and the sequencing and layers of nuance between Palestinian refugees, the right of return, the recognition of the Jewish nature of the State of Israel, and a host of other issues lie in a delicate balance. Introducing the issues of Jewish refugees at this stage may set back the discussions and may risk violating the principle that the committee sought to respect in ensuring that recognition of Jewish refugees does not diminish or complete the situation of Palestinian refugees. Mr. Speaker, in keeping with Canada's principled approach to the conflict, we agree with the committee's first recommendation that the Government of Canada officially recognize the experience of Jewish refugees who were displaced from states in the Middle East and North Africa after 1948. Such recognition, long overdue, would be historic and would place Canada at the forefront of the international discussion on Jewish refugees. Canada's official recognition would be one small step in acknowledging this difficult period for Jewish communities of the region. Given the current delicate state of affairs, with closely held negotiations ongoing, it is not an opportune time to implement the second recommendation. By seeking to influence the parties to acknowledge the plight of Jewish refugees at this time, Canada would run the risk of having our recognition of Jewish refugees diminish and/or compete with the situation of Palestinian refugees. At this stage, therefore, we believe that the appropriate course of action is to officially recognize the experience of Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa while continuing to support U.S.-led efforts in bringing the parties toward a comprehensive two-state solution. Peace will only be reached through a negotiated agreement between the two parties that guarantees Israel's right to live in peace and security with its neighbors and leads to the establishment of a viable and independent Palestinian state. Mr. Speaker, this brings to an end my comments. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened with some interest here and in the lobby to my friends' comments about this report. It's a very important issue. My question is to gauge the comfort level he has, because as has been discussed before you took the chair, Mr. Speaker, in this debate, that the timing of this debate is most curious. That we were in the midst, the House of Commons was in the midst of discussing a point of privilege that the Speaker had ruled on, finding a prima facie case of contempt for Parliament by one of his members, that it was this day. This report was issued in November of last year, but it was on this day that the government needed to bring in this debate on this issue, an issue of incredible sensitivity to the Jewish community, both here in Canada and abroad. And I find it somewhat, I'll admit this, I've been getting some emails from those in the Jewish community that are offended because they feel like their issue is being used to block a debate about a member being found in contempt, and they don't know why the Conservative government would do this. Allow the debate to go free. If this was such an important issue, and I'll conclude with this, if this was an important issue to the Conservatives and urgent to the Conservatives, then one would have assumed that a report issued in November of last year would have seen the light of day before March of this year. The timing is, beyond coincidence, is cynical. And I wonder if he feels comfortable having...
Order. The honourable member for Don Valley West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the comment. It's interesting, as we heard from the previous speaker in this debate, that had he the opportunity to be the whip for the third party, and I incidentally encourage him in his aspirations, that he too would have a problem determining the priority of these different issues, because there are so many important issues right now. And so to the member's comment previously, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important that we do have to balance all of the issues of the day as they come before us and truly give them all time. And clearly this issue is one that has importance. The committee has made its recommendations to the House, and I think it's important that we have appropriate time to discuss it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for York Centre.
Thank you, Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague from Don Valley West for his excellent speech on a very important and significant issue of history. But I do want to ask him, our Prime Minister was recently in Israel and spoke in the Knesset, where he said that Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state is non-negotiable and it is absolute. Now, I would like to ask my friend from Don Valley West if he can comment on our government's position on Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, and how he can distinguish it from the positions of both the Liberal Party and the NDP, and if he can understand, because I certainly can, the reluctance of the two parties today to discuss this very important issue, given their stand on Israel. Thank you.
The honourable member for Don Valley West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague from York Centre. It's true that we just returned from a historic state visit to Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan with our Prime Minister. And Mr. Speaker, it was a remarkable opportunity to witness a number of different cultures and issues that were pertinent to this time. Our Prime Minister spoke in the Knesset in what was without question a historic presentation, and spoke to the friendship between Canada and Israel, and it was based on democracy. The Prime Minister spoke to the fact that our country recognizes Israel's right to exist and would stand with Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East. Most importantly, Mr. Speaker, because there are those who surround them who do not believe they have the right to exist. For this debate to conclude appropriately today, we have to agree, I believe, that there is a two-state solution that must be found. It will be found only by the two participating parties coming to agreement on that discussion, and clearly they both will agree that Israel has the right to exist in a safe and secure environment. Thank you.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Chambly-Vaudois.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. C'est intéressant parce qu'on prêche beaucoup l'importance de la démocratie, puis on ne semble pas être capable de se regarder dans le miroir ou regarder dans notre propre cour. En fait, c'est le député de Don Valley West nous a parlé du fait qu'on parle des enjeux au fur et à mesure qui se présentent devant nous. Puis c'est intéressant parce que la raison qu'on abordait l'enjeu de l'outrage du Parlement commis par le député de Mississauga-Streetsville, c'est parce que, justement, il y a eu une décision de la présidence. C'est pas les jeux de l'opposition, comme qui aiment souvent le dire, c'est pas le fear-mongering ou toutes les autres choses qui semblent vouloir toujours utiliser comme excuse. C'est le président qui s'est levé en cette Chambre et qui a pris une décision concernant des accusations extrêmement graves et importantes par rapport à un projet de loi qui traite de notre démocratie et de nos élections. Alors, quand on est pris avec cet enjeu-là, on a évidemment immédiatement commencé le débat pour référer la question au comité de la procédure et des affaires de la Chambre. Et maintenant, on veut changer le sujet en prétendant qu'il y a des affaires plus importantes à aborder. Mais, Monsieur le Président, en cette Chambre, si la priorité n'est pas une décision qui a été prise sur le champ par la présidence, je ne vois pas qu'est-ce qui pourrait être plus important. Alors, j'aimerais savoir si le député reconnaît l'importance d'une décision prise par la présidence hier en cette Chambre et qu'on devrait être en train de discuter en ce moment.
The honourable member for Don Valley West.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me begin by just saying how privileged I am to have the opportunity to address this issue here today. This is an important debate, and as my colleague from York Centre Reese just asked as well, we talked about, or he spoke about the recent Prime Minister's state visit to Israel, the West Bank, and to Syria. And throughout the morning, we've heard much debate today on where are the priorities. Is it the Speaker's ruling? Is it the Ukraine? Is it Syria? There are many issues today that are very, very relevant that all need to be discussed. And this one brings me particularly poignantly to the issue of refugees. On this recent trip to Jordan, Mr. Speaker, I had the good fortune to get on a travel by helicopter to the Syrian-Jordanian border. And I witnessed hundreds upon hundreds of men, women, children carrying their worldly belongings across the border. And I tell you, it was heart-wrenching to see the plight of the Syrian refugees as they fled for their lives with all that they could carry. And so this issue is important. It is a particularly important one. The timing is now. We have the opportunity to discuss it, and I think it's something we should carry this debate to conclusion on.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Nanaimo, Alberni.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the honourable member's intervention, and I wanted to ask him, we have a refugee situation we're discussing today with 820,000 people involved, a massive displacement of people from their homes, their lands, their culture, their language. They have to leave everything behind. Here we are just a few decades later, half a century later maybe. How is it possible? I wonder if the member would comment, how is it possible that displacement of 820,000 people could largely be forgotten? I mean, everybody seems to know about Palestinian people and the Palestinian refugees, a common thing to talk about. But how is it possible that displacement of so many people has largely been forgotten?
The honourable member for Don Valley West, short answer, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine, but in this day of instant messaging, instant information, we hear about crises that are occurring by the minute and in real time. And clearly, 825,000 refugees who almost, I guess, went into obscurity, suffered all of the same horrors as the refugees we watch today. I can't explain it other than to say it's time that we recognize this, and I think that given today's debate, it's an important opportunity to, in fact, take that time. Thank you, Mr.